Welcome to the Media Roundtable special edition, where we dive into the secrets of the craft and provide our perspective on industry topics in service of the Chief Audio Officer. Who is the Chief Audio Officer? That is the person who is a marketer whose neck is on the line to make the audio programs work. And it's a very narrow focus, but it's an important one because, as one journalist, Matthew Iglesias, said on this show a couple of years ago, he said it is the advertiser who fundamentally decides what kind of content is worth being created. We could probably have a debate about that, but certainly it's an important position in the ecosystem that we work in. So we're really trying to narrowcast to that audience. I am your host, Dan Granger, CEO and founder of Oxford Road. And today we're joined by a very special guest, somebody that whose work we have all heard, seen, felt, and quoted often. It is Larry Rosin, president of Edison Research. And we're going to be highlighting several pieces of research that have come out of Edison recently and having a broader conversation about, what does it mean for the industry and what does it mean if you're in the business of monetization or advertising within the industry. So before we dive into that, let me tell you who else we have with us. We have Miranda Romano, who is an increasingly present and visible force at the agency and here on this podcast. Welcome, Miranda.
Oh, thank you.
Miranda oversees all of our media efforts at Oxford Road. We have James Ingrassia, our head of client services. Welcome, James.
Hello. And
we have Neal, Lucey, who is planning and strategy boss. I never get your actual title fixed in my head, but I know that these are the things that you're overseeing. And really, when we need somebody really smart to solve a problem, we call Neal and Giles, who are really the thought leaders within our thought leadership brand. So glad to have you back with us, Neal, and thanks for your help in the preparations for this discussion.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
Okay, so let's dive in with you, Larry. But I'm gonna set up the conversation because we've been reading your research for a while. It's very, very helpful. Some people say that the Edison ranking of podcasts is the only game in town in terms of reliability. But there have been a couple pieces that you put out recently, and Miranda, you actually flagged that this most recent report was something that we should have a conversation about. Miranda, from your perspective, do you mind just setting up why you thought this was so important for us to cover?
Yeah, well, I guess some context. So Larry's reached out to us a couple times just regarding content that we put out. And so it made sense for us to finally meet in person at Podcast Movement. He mentioned that he was a frequent listener and shared some of the work that he'd been doing, particularly the exciting research that was just released that we'll be getting into a little bit more. And so I thought it was the perfect opportunity to have him discuss his latest research in this milestone moment of audio.
And this milestone moment, I'll give away the headline, and then Larry, I'm going to let you fill in the blanks for us here. Sounds like podcast has, on-demand listening has surpassed linear listening in 2023 for the first time ever. So if you don't mind, welcome to the show, and please unpack this a little bit for us.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me on your show. I do listen frequently, and you guys are the first place I've ever encountered the word roundtable as a verb. So I'm happy to roundtable with you guys today. Yes, the data that Miranda is referring to is from a study we do called Share of Ear, which is a really cool research project we've been doing. It's coming up on 10 full years now. And basically, this is our attempt to measure the entire world of audio. There's always been, first it was Arbitron ratings and Nielsen ratings for radio, and there's been different ways of measuring different aspects of the world of audio. But there's never been before Share of Ear, the ability to put sort of everything on the same scale and see how things have changed over time. And so we organize the way it works, it's a diary study. People keep a very detailed one-day audio usage diary. I'm happy to discuss methods, but just trust that it's done in a very high quality methodological fashion. And we're doing the same thing. We update it once a quarter, and we've been doing now for many, many quarters. And the trend that you're referring to is one that we've seen coming for a very, very long time, which is in 2014, when we started this study, there was a very, very large gap between what we call linear listening. Essentially, you sit back and just consume whatever is sent out there to you, like listening to the radio, listening to Sirius XM's radio type products, things like that, versus on-demand choices, choosing a song or a playlist, choosing spoken word content from a podcast, etc. And so, well, where there was once like a 40-point gap between, it was like a 70-30 ratio, linear over on demand, we have watched as that gap has just narrowed and narrowed and narrowed to the point in our most recent update, for the first time, those two lines crossed. And now by just less than a point, but it seems likely to just keep going in this same direction, on demand consumption in terms of time spent has surpassed linear consumption.
All right, so tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies. Indeed, Shopify, NetSuite, Headspace, Quip, Theragun, Postmates. You know, I'm not only the host of the Media Roundtable, but also CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated audio ad agency. And what that means is that we help great companies, many that you have probably heard of on some of the other podcasts that you listen to. We help them test and scale campaigns in audio channels, with podcast being one of those leading channels. Some of the work that we do includes media planning and buying, as well as analytics, attribution, and insights. And we also have a very special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. We have our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. If you're looking to be involved in audio and you want a partner that can help work with you to make sure that you achieve unprecedented ROI and massive scale, you should get in touch with us at Oxford Road. And by the way, the only reason that we're able to do the work of the Media Roundtable is because we have a great team at Oxford Road that supports us and makes it possible. So, you know, what we're doing is not just a podcast, but we're really trying to help brands live out their values and balance that with their business objectives, which is an increasingly hard thing to do in this world of misinformation and malice that's infecting so much of our media. But at Oxford Road, we don't want to just broker this stuff. We want to impact the industry for good. We want to raise the bar on what gets created. And Oxford Road is helping make that possible through the Media Roundtable. So if you're somebody that's interested in working with an ad agency or a partner on this type of work for your advertising campaigns, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. And get in touch with us, or at least just sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer. That's oxfordroad.com. So, Neal, I'm going to give you first question on this, because I know you had a couple areas you wanted to dig into.
Yeah, I think one is firstly an observation. I'm curious to hear Larry's perspective on it, because I've been looking at this data for a while now. And I mean, I think the first thing, like one of the things I noticed in like retrospect, you really see the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, where the line was, I mean, we were going to get to this point where on demand would overtake linear, but I don't think we would be here in 2023 at this moment had there not been the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts, and like how much, maybe, do you have an idea how much the pandemic accelerated the shifts in listenership?
Yeah, it's interesting, because if we take it sort of item by item, some of them, if you look at their sort of trend line from before, like even if you just look at AM/FM radio listening as an example, it really went down dramatically in 2020, and it had this huge downturn, and then it is actually kind of flattened out, still going down, but kind of flattened out. And if you draw the trend line and pretend COVID had never happened, it's probably where it would have been anyway. It just got there in a very odd pattern, dropping so dramatically quickly with the advent of the pandemic. Other things, you're right. I think there are things, especially in this on-demand type stuff that we've been talking about, where people had maybe more time or inclination, just looking for things to do, whatever it might have been. And so you saw this dramatic increase in usage and demand. And then that seems to have kinked the line ever upward. And so, yeah, I do think, look, they're going to fill libraries with books about the impact of the pandemic on every aspect of life. But there is little doubt that many of the things that we've been tracking accelerated, and people discovered new ways to consume audio that they hadn't either thought about or heard about or just even bothered to try before.
Yeah,
Larry. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Neal.
Well, yeah. Well, if I want to hear your question, because I think you're picking up on that point. I have a separate question.
Well, yeah, I've got a couple things I want to dig into here, Larry. So when we look at the pattern of consumption shifting from linear to on demand, how does it compare to the pattern that we've seen in video?
It's almost identical. It's interesting because Nielsen, almost at the exact same time, said that on-demand viewing crossed linear viewing, and really within weeks of our report.
No
so
kidding.
Very, very similar. Yeah, I'll send you the
I'm
link
really
to that.
surprised because there's just so much more video, right? I mean, if you're counting TikTok, if you're counting Netflix, if you're counting YouTube, that's staggering to me that linear held on as long as it did, because normally when we see technological shifts, video is usually quite a ways ahead of audio, is it not?
Yeah, but I mean, you bring up a good point, which is if our survey is 13 plus. I think that Nielsen data is maybe like 2 plus or something like that. But if you look at it by age groups, it's like, let's say the youngest people, the medium age, and then the oldest, it's like 3 completely different stories. And so the younger people have made the switch to on-demand in both audio and video, long before that. Those lines crossed. They were not crossed actually when we started 2014, but they crossed very quickly thereafter. And that was overwhelmingly on demand among young people. Like I said, the say 35, 54 in the middle, and then 55 plus. Yes, on demand has increased 55 plus, but there's still a huge gap. And 55 plus is still listening to far more linear content, or watching on TV for that matter, linear content, as compared to on demand. So it's so dependent on age groups.
One question I have for you, Larry, is looking at the data. I mean, you can split that 1 point. Look like in 2019, they both were converging 1 point away, and God knows what the trend line would be on those. But I'm very curious of the selection process between what is linear and what is on demand, because I notice Pandora's free service is included in linear, but then paid streaming is included in on demand. And if we separated that completely, like pure plays and radio, would the numbers look a little different?
Yeah, look, it would, of course. I mean, look, I always say, Moses didn't come down from Sinai with the answers to all these sorts of deep questions about what to put in which category. And I've had people ask me, for instance, if you using, say, Spotify paid service or Pandora's or whatever, and you choose a playlist and just let it play out, isn't that essentially functionally linear kinds of consumption? And you have to make decisions on how you're going to group these things. And we sort of chose to consider, I think we could pretty much agree that all podcast listening is on demand, even if I suppose you could use a service that just fires up another podcast after you finish the one that you were consuming, or the way YouTube does, say, in videos and things like that. So we had to make some decisions on how to group things. But really, we pretty much argue that any sort of paid service that allows you the capability, at the very least, if you wanted to select, for instance, a specific song, even if you chose not to at that moment, we're still considering that on demand, even though somebody could be engaging in more of a linear-ish kind of behavior while using on-demand services. I hope that makes sense. How I was trying to explain.
Well, I'm gonna play it back to you, because I've been pondering this, and I've been trying to think, like, okay, if I'm a paid user of a streaming service versus free, is there an implication that, like, if you took away the word on demand and you replaced it with the word control, would that actually give a truer lane line and definition where some of these, you actually can have more influence over the type of content that comes at you if you are paying, and therefore we're going to toss it in the on-demand category? I'm just trying to think of a proxy.
I mean, it's complicated. Someone could argue, well, you can change the radio station. Isn't that an aspect of control? So like I said, these almost are like philosophical questions. And the one thing I'll say is that we at least are consistently defining these. We're out there with what we're doing, so that, yes, someone could say, well, if you reconfigured it one way or the other, it would change. But the one thing that is absolutely true is that data that I showed you that triggered our discussion here is using the exact same definitions over time. So the change is still the story, whether or not, if we recategorize some things different ways, it would separate the lines in some different fashion. To me, the story is the change, and the change would be consistent no matter how we organized it.
I think the point that you make about the video moving, like kind of having a similar milestone in terms of the timing of on demand taking over linear, and then I think that's important. And when we think about our marketers, I mean, essentially we're moving more and more into an on demand media consumption world, right? Where perishable content or live content has is going to always be there, sports, for instance, but more and more consumers are going to have the choice on when they consume their media, and that's going to impact, I think, and we're not sure how it's going to impact us as marketers, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on, maybe what that means for marketers in terms of if we're living in this on-demand world, and maybe a world where it's much more the consumer's control when, where, how they want to consume content. What do marketers need to think about? Or from your perspective, have you thought about that?
Oh, I have lots of thoughts about all of that kind of stuff. So one thing for sure is that no one should get confused and think that when we say on demand, we mean that advertisers cannot access some of that time, right? Podcasting, which is, your big specialization, is overwhelmingly ad supported. But even, even plenty of on-demand music services can be ad supported. If you're watching YouTube, it's on demand. Not their paid service, but they're just regular free service. It's both on demand and ad supported. So advertisers can still get to these people. So no one should be confused about that aspect of what we said. The other thing is that, to me, the biggest story we get out of share of ear is that consumers are spending so much time with audio, all forms of audio. Our average is over 4 hours per day. I always say that's an average with a broad standard deviation. We have some people record virtually none or actually no audio consumption, some recording phenomenal amounts, 10, 11, 12 hours of audio consumption in their day. But on average, it's a little over 4 hours. And so advertisers don't spend nearly as much in total against the whole audio sector, given how much time is being spent. So that's point number one. And then point number two is they should be spending more money in digital audio in all its forms, podcasting to be sure, but also streaming. So the whole, in my opinion, all of audio is under invested in by the advertisers of America, and digital audio in particular is just sitting right there with such great data, such great convergence, such great stories, and yet it remains too big a struggle, in my opinion, to get them to give more of their budget to it.
I would say I have a couple of points on that. So I think the first, more to like advertisers who specifically rely heavily on linear programming, I would say now is time just to start to figure out like whether or not your target audience is included in that shift. So Larry, you mentioned like if we just look at 55 plus, it's a very different story than what we're seeing overall. And I think that, it's up to advertisers to figure out how this trend impacts them. And and to start diversifying their media mix. So they're not, totally reliant on a medium that's trending downwards. But also I would say if, for an advertiser, if your audience is still predominantly on linear, I would say that that there is an opportunity to get more value out of current media partners, or even if you're considering testing into linear media, now is a good time because, on the front lines, like we're seeing the pricing be very opportunistic and the barrier to entries are lowering. I also want to point out that like we've actually been discussing this with our clients, and we even had a slide on it at the summit. But audio spend, if we just look at spend, not listening or consumption, spend in 2015 was at 17 billion, with radio at 85%. In 2023, I think it's slated to be at 17.5, and radio is down to 61% with that, with that spend moving to podcast and streaming. So, on the spend side, we're seeing the shift as well. And Larry, as you pointed out, I'm gonna call out, I think you say Jeff Vidler of Signal Hill Insights. I just read, he posted an article, and he also argued that digital audio really hasn't capitalized on the substantial growth in digital investments, because typically digital audio budgets are restricted to just audio. And so most of the revenue growth, in podcasts and streaming has really come at the expense of over-the-air radio, not the larger digital ad marketplace.
Right. Nothing I disagree with there. I mean, the single most important number to me is that first number, the 17 or 17.5 billion, that we all need to see that number grow. And then all of you guys can fight, will happily fight it out to get your piece of it. But it should, that top line number really should grow if advertisers are being thoughtful about where consumers are and where they're spending their time, and frankly, what media produces for them.
Yeah.
Do you think that when we see the limited, like you look at the year-over-year pie in all things audio staying relatively flat, even though we do see shifting, some slices are growing, some are shrinking. How much of that do you think gets sucked away by the subscriptions that are non-ad supported, that actually pulls some of the impact off the table so that maybe it's actually more fair than it appears?
Right. So we have definitely seen that trend over the 9+ years of share of ear. The number of people who say they subscribe to at least one paid audio service has more than doubled. It was less than a quarter. It's now more than 50% who have a subscription to something, whether it's SiriusXM, Spotify paid, or any Apple Music, Amazon Music, any of those paid services. And we have seen similarly the time change. Still, a majority of time is spent with non-paid services, but that is growing. And so, people have shown an increased willingness, similar to in the video market, to sort of buy their way out of advertisements, assuming there's value in terms of what they're getting from it. But still, the ad-based part of audio is still a huge part. You can still reach virtually everyone. Virtually everyone will be reached at one point or another in their day of listening that we're measuring in share of ear at some point by ad-supported audio. So yes, there are shifts going on in there, but there is definitely a pattern towards people subscribing to something that eliminates the ads. So, again, and like we even break down SiriusXM between their speech channels, which do have ads, and their music channels, which do not. So even in that case, you're paying, but some of your listening is still ad support.
So I've been in audio professionally for approximately 20 years, and forever, every executive of every publisher has always said, we need to get our fair share. Audio never gets our fair share. And I always kind of blew it off a little bit and thought, well, we're incentivized to feel this way. But when you do study the ratio of time spent with media against percentage of revenue, there is a delta. How much do you think the major slices of the audio pie are under monetized if you benchmark them against other types of media? Truly.
Well, I think Miranda touched on this. Legacy and inertia and just budgets. They don't necessarily change at the same pace that the underlying data would support for any number of reasons. I honestly, truly believe that broadcast radio doesn't get what it deserves, but you could still argue that within the audio sector, it's getting more than it deserves based on our data. Both of those things can be true at the same time. And,
well, I'm sorry, say that one more time. Which gets more than it deserves?
I'm saying that broadcast radio does not get what it's deserved in terms of the grand scheme of advertising and the time spent, like you said, but not just the time spent, how effective advertising can be. And yet it probably gets more than it deserves within the audio, just isolating audio.
I see.
Because
it's not getting what it should. If you had the wand to change all planning, not only would you see the pie expand, but you would still see money coming off of the terrestrial signals and onto the new, because it's hard to make a case these days that you should be spending more on terrestrial radio, which is a very complex conversation, right? Because I think most folks would like to just say, hey, look, it's print at this point. We wish them well. We'll see them on their digital, in their digital future, right? And so how does the industry sustain that shift?
Well, again, I'm arguing that all of audio is underfunded. So if more money was gushing in and some of that went to broadcast radio, even if more of it went to digital radio, podcasts, et cetera, to me, that would be a more equitable expenditure of the total advertising and marketing budgets of the advertisers of the United States. But yeah, I mean, look, radio still has strengths, right? I mean, radio still has an enormous reach. Radio and it's legit. Like in our survey, 63% of our respondents age 13 and older will record some radio listening on their diary day. It's an enormous, just in one day. And then we're used to seeing bigger numbers correctly for the weekly reach of radio or monthly reach of radio. So it still has an enormous reach and still has a story to tell, and it's still effective for advertisers. That said, there's a reason that a lot more money is going into the digital part of the audio space, as it should be, because it offers many advantages over what radio, as you touched upon, something that's growing versus something that's declining, something that's generally younger as compared to something that's generally older in its reach, and of course something that can offer certain analytical opportunities and measurement opportunities that aren't as robust necessarily on the broadcast side.
Well, and they don't have as many limitations in in the way that they execute their content. If you're still doing terrestrial radio, you have at least one arm tied behind your back, in that now you can't be everywhere. You still can't be everywhere. Digital content can. You have limits on what you're allowed to talk about. You have to go through, different levels of scrutiny. There, you're in a fight for share within a local region oftentimes, which skews what type of content you're going to be focused on. There's just a lot of limitations that make it very hard to compete with an open ecosystem that doesn't have these restrictions. Sorry, go ahead, Neal.
Yeah, I was going because I want to pick up on the reach topic of radio, because I think sometimes we misconstrue reach with time spent. So we're saying, oh, time spent for radio is declining, yet it's reaching 63% of people on I think it's a weekly basis, daily basis, on a daily basis. So I think sometimes there's a disconnect, because I think we confuse those two. Though I want to talk about that because one thing that I like about your research is it's diary based. So they're tracking what they're doing during their day, and so you're getting a full picture of how they're consuming radio, be it through a terrestrial stream or a digital only stream or a combination. The one thing I don't know that we're really that great at, and I don't know if there's other services that do as good a job of that, but I don't know if we're really that good about figuring out how we can buy across all those components more seamlessly, so that we're maximizing that reach. I think a lot of times we're buying the terrestrial, we're buying the digital stream separately, and we're not looking at, or it's not being sold to us as kind of one component.
Well, right, and obviously the terrestrial companies would love for you to just give us all your money, and we'll parcel it out among the different elements of what we have. To your point, with regard to share of ear, there really is nothing else quite like it in terms of measuring the whole audio space and measuring it on very detailed based, not just what they're listening to, what they're listening on, what kind of content is it, et cetera. So it really can make for a terrific planning tool for anyone who wants to put their money into audio, to understand which audiences are consuming which part of audio, and like you were implying, what's growing, what's declining, what's delivering different demographic groups, et cetera.
Well, I think the networks actually they're not making it very easy to buy across them all, because as we've learned, a lot of the bigger networks have a podcast sales team and a radio sales team and a streaming sales team. And seldom do you have one person that can let you flow through them all. So as an agency, we kind of say, all right, well, let's go with streaming and podcast because we can track it better than radio. And then that may not be the right answer, but it's just the reality of ease of use at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Making it easy is or the failure to make it easy enough is one of the reasons that advertisers will say they don't spend more money in audio and each of its component parts across it.
Well, yeah, and I think to James's point, it's hard to buy, but it's harder to measure across different outputs, and I think that's probably where most opportunities go to die, is when you have to explain to a brand that, yeah, you can get efficiencies on the exact same content in this venue versus that, but you're going to have to come up with you have to do a whole new dance to learn how to measure that. All of a sudden they go, no, I'm not going to embrace that level of complexity. So it's a challenging time. So I want to move on to a couple other stories, but I think to just put a pin in this one, Larry, do you have any guidance for brands, for a marketer that's looking at this, other than going, okay, there's more there than I thought. Maybe our budgets should be reflective of people's consumption habits in a more fair way. Is there anything tactical that you see here in the way that we think about the other aspects, whether it's measurement, whether it's our approach to creative? If we see that on-demand consumption continues to grow, what changes do I need to make as a brand or as a marketer as I'm thinking about this?
Well, I mean, I'm sure you'll be glad to hear me say this. Obviously, they should be spending more money in something like podcasts, which not only is on demand, so it's with that trend, it's growing, and we haven't even touched upon that, but in share of ear, our percentage of time spent with podcasting goes up every time we update the data, and it's gone up over 5x since we started the project in 2014. And it offers plenty of opportunities for measurement and tracking the results of campaigns, et cetera. So there's a reason I listened to your show in the first place, and there's a reason that I figured I might be a good guest, because I'm aligned with your point of view that people should be spending more money in podcasting. Like I said, it's on trend with everything I'm talking about.
It is, and I think one of our fears that we've been vocal about for the industry is just that the podcast becomes more like radio than radio becomes like podcast, right? I have real concerns about the increased ad loads that we're seeing and the movement away from the very personal nature of podcast. What's your view on that subject? Because I know, the world's changed a lot since you started with Edison, and you must have a very interesting perspective as you see it evolve.
So I understand that concern. I'm a very heavy podcast listener myself, and so I've noticed two things. One is more ads, but to your point, often a very different, a change in the kind of ads that you'll hear. And I think radio allowed way too many truly bad ads to get on the air. In some cases, advertising bad things, kind of ripoffs and things like that, but just often just totally ignoring the quality of the ad itself. And, often they're just so jarring and so difficult to listen to, et cetera. And there's an ethos out there that, oh, you remembered how much you hated my ad. That means, I succeeded, which I've never ascribed to. I think that's limited returns on that kind of stuff. So I share your concerns. I will point out that even the most junked up podcasts you'll hear these days tend to have still far, far lower ad loads than the typical hour of broadcast radio, especially in terms of speech-based radio, talk radio or sports talk radio, or things of that nature. Those are often running 18 to 20 minutes, not units, minutes of commercials per hour. And I don't think I've ever heard a podcast that, even if it wasn't an hour long, if you multiplied it out, would be anything close to 18 or 20 minutes in ads. So I'm not here saying junk it up more, add more and more, but I'm saying I don't think it's quite to the point. I understand the concern, the fear, but I haven't really felt like it was the same kind of thing as you can hear on the radio.
Well, I was talking to a few folks at I was only at the tail end of podcast movement, but we were talking about, audio, if it ever got its fair share, then what would happen? Would that mean that podcast and streaming would have to be 20 plus minutes of commercial time per hour, and therefore we've just kicked ourselves back into the kind of the old model? Is there a path forward that you see for the industry where we can get, the monetization that we feel the channel deserves without completely diluting it and, going back in time to a place we came to get away from?
Yeah, it's like anything. If you look, podcasting gets, from the radio perspective, extraordinary CPMs. And every time anyone seems to measure it, it says, oh, they've merited, they've earned those extraordinary CPMs. So as long as that remains even remotely the case, but certainly the case it is now, I don't think it's inevitable that podcasting is going to need to do the equivalent. Radio has tended not to have hardly any rate integrity. Because they figure like everything is marginal money and they'll just keep taking it and taking it. And I don't think you can ignore the part that is played in those declines that share of ear has measured over the last 10 years. And if share of ear were 20 years old, the numbers would trail back in the same direction another 10 years. The spot loads on the radio are absolutely part of the reason, what I said earlier, that people are willing to pay their way out of the ads. And they're part of the general reason why people are listening less to radio. It's not the only reason. Competition, it's kind of a set field. We haven't seen a big change over time in the amount of time spent with audio. So it had to come from somewhere. Radio had the biggest chunk. But radio has made it too easy for people to leave the radio in doing some of the things that you're talking about.
Yeah, in our view, there's a lot of research that needs to happen, and I think we're motivated to be a part of this solution. But I think we have to better define to the advertising community what is the delta between what position you are in the show. What is the delta in value if you're in a show that has an ad break with 4 ads smashed back to back versus somebody that, only may run 3 or 4 ads over the course of an hour? What is the difference between a pre, a mid, and a post? I think there's still real debate to be had around that. And most importantly, what is the value of a host recommending your business to their audience versus the same copy pre-produced by an advertiser? These are things that need to get researched and published without an agenda, brought to you by people that don't make more money depending on what that outcome is. Because if we don't get clarity on these things, I fear that we are just going to kind of get backed into the world that we tried to leave, that, we're trying to evolve away from. Because right now there's no caps, there's no clocks, there's no commitment from the creator community that we're going to limit how much ad exposure we give you. And as I see it, the only way that we can create a scenario where we can start to fully monetize the channel without diluting the amount of programming time significantly is going to be by charging a premium for those that have greater access to talent and greater talent involvement. If you don't do that, you have no option but to shove more ads in. And the more you shove more ads in, the less they're worth. So I have real concerns for the industry on this. And I feel that there's a need for us to join forces with a lot of other folks and start to establish some guidelines and some limits on what we're going to tolerate as an industry.
Yeah, Dan, to your
I think,
point. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Neal.
well, I'm going to tee you up, I think, Miranda. I think, some of the things that you've seen or we've seen and we've actually talked about in the podcast is some of the ad experiences now. I think with programmatic, where you have there's not a clean break. So the ads are inserted sort of, and they can be inserted in the middle of a conversation. And I think we all experience this on YouTube, right? Where you're watching a 5-minute video. Clearly there's no break for an ad, but then the ad, comes up because that's how they make money. So I think there's also that component of the ad experience and what it's doing to our listening experience as well.
Yeah, it's a very disruptive experience. Like sometimes I'll just be listening to a podcast and like a Spanish language ad will come up and then an English one, and it's incredibly disruptive. And Dan, to your point, like I see very little regulation on like number of ad units and where they're being placed. I think publishers for the most part are just treating it as like a one size fits all. Let's just see how many ad units that we can cram in. And when we actually look at performance by publisher, we see worse performance from the ones that are running, 7+ ads per episode and have multiple mid-roll breaks, and better performance from the ones that have very few. And just in digging in a little bit deeper with a couple of partners, like also again, the ones that perform better that have few, it seems that they leave it up to the producers to very strategically like figure out where each placement goes, and they leave it to them to determine how many ad units there should be depending on how long the episode. So they're actually looking and checking for things like, okay, what's the relevance to the content that we're talking about, and where's the best place to put it. So just like one example is, we were talking to someone, I won't name names, but this is a good example, and the producers would like find a spot in the content where the hosts were telling a joke, and they would put the ad in the middle of the joke so that the listener almost like had to listen through. Like that's a good example. And I actually, for any publishers listening out there, like I'd love to collaborate and learn if there are any publishers that are actually looking at how the number of ad units is impacting listen through rates. There was a case study recently, and the insights are nothing new, right? But it was a recent study, and it was related to CTV, but I think it can apply to podcasts. And it was ad overexposure led to eroded purchase intent and negative associations, not just with the brand, but with the streaming provider as well, for anyone that like heard an ad 6 or more times. And even in podcasts, not only do we get in some podcasts like inundated with ads, but there are even some scenarios where I get the same ad sometimes back to back, which is just like insane to me, that like no one is watching, no one is looking, like there's no verification. And even if there's like not a human element, that the tech hasn't even developed enough yet to check for those types of things. It was like publishers just rush to cram in however many ad units they can fit without kind of figuring out the logistics.
Or
so this is a lot of.
Can you tell I'm frustrated by this topic?
Or they sold a lot of impressions, and now they have to find a way to meet that impressions goal. And part of the way they're meeting that impressions goal could be that you get multiple ads in the same episode from the same.
And here's what I'll say too, like that publishers where they've got like 9+ ads, like your CPM is worth $4, right? So it's like, we can pay you, a $20 to $35 CPM for a host read, or we can pay you a $4 CPM, because that's what it's worth.
And now you know why Miranda is our head of media. Larry, that was a lot of us talking collectively here. And do you want to react to any or all of that?
Well, I generally agree with all of it. I think, like any transaction in any field, it comes down to value. And, podcasting has to date provided tremendous value to advertisers in any way they measure it. And really, in general, done an incredible job of sort of getting the advertisers on the listener's side. The sort of people seeing them as part of what's supporting the media that they enjoy so much. And I think advertisers do have, to Miranda's point, they have to think about that relationship and make sure they don't abuse it, or exactly what she's saying. The value will go down, and they'll be just throwing money at things as opposed to watching it work, which has been the history up till now.
I've also noticed
So-
sometimes they don't know that it's even happening. I started flagging it to a few of the bigger networks, and I'll send them the time, I'll send them where I was listening to, and they'll look in and they'll say, thanks for flagging that. There was a glitch in our system that played the same ad every single time you listened on that. And so it's up to, I guess, everyone, well, it's up to them to grade their own homework and make sure that it's right, but then it's up to everyone else to say something when they hear something is not running correctly.
Yeah, more advocacy.
And look, to complicate the problem, we've seen a couple things come out in the news. Did you guys see what the Wall Street Journal just put out about Spotify? And, I don't want to jump on they're the tallest poppy, so everybody, loves to air their dirty laundry, right? But the way I look at it is they got the same problem as everybody else. It's just bigger, and it's not that different than I think what has happened with most employers in this country in the last few years, which is there was a lot of exuberance and everybody was trying to capitalize on a robust economy. A lot of people had discretionary income to buy things that they didn't before. And so we all got into a bidding war over talent, right? Whether that's employees at your company or it's, talent that creates content for you. So I don't like to pick on them specifically for this, but I do think it's indicative of a problem. And as we talk about audio accidentally finding themselves in a place where they have no choice but to oversaturate their content with ads and dilute the thing that they're trying to solve, I think this is another example of that. Larry, do you have any reaction to what you read in the journal?
Well, I think they acknowledge themselves publicly that they got a little ahead of themselves, spent some money. Look, if you're going to drop $1 billion at an industry, you're not likely to make every call correctly. And they clearly got overly excited about celebrity, to be sure, certain kinds of celebrity at the very least. We've seen some celebrity podcasts really do unbelievably well. I mean, I look at the Smart List as the example of a show that, they weren't ultra A-listers, but they were solid B guys, and they've really put together a tremendous story there, leveraging their celebrity. I think people can get caught up in things like the royal family and things like that, and think anyone cares what they have to say about any topic other than the royal family, which I think was the big mistake that they made, that people would want to hear Harry and Meghan talk about anything other than dishing dirt on their family members. And things of that nature. So, they got a little excited. They had a big pot of money to play with. And now they're doing the right thing from a business perspective of evaluating what worked, evaluating what hasn't worked, and putting that back in a smarter place. So I tend to be far less harsh towards them and others. As you said, there was a long period of time where you could borrow money essentially for free. And they had the okay of their board to go ahead and drop $1 billion at this nascent industry called podcasting. And let's look at the other side. They're in many different ways of measurement, the biggest player in the game now. So they did accomplish that.
I appreciate that. And I know we're low on time here. I want to throw one last topic at you. There was something that came across on Twitter, or whatever you prefer to call it today, from a group that caught my eye called Podcast AI, which is an interesting company in that they've got some features that I think a lot of creators need. They can transcribe episodes, help you identify speakers in an automated fashion, help you create a table of contents. for your show, so you can more easily know how to parse out and distribute what you end up recording. But then it goes a step further, and they show how they can actually take a sample of host voices and create advertisements that they never had to voice. And I've talked about this before, and I'm going to keep talking about it every time I see it. To me, this is the opposite of the direction that an industry needs to go that is built on a foundation of trust. And it's the slippery slope of trading efficiency today for the trust and the sustainability that we need tomorrow to have something that's really going to work. Do you have any perspective on this or things like it, where you see, we all agree technology is very good and necessary and important, but where it's being used in ways that are going to end up harming the industry, perhaps more than we realize?
So I have no research to support anything we have. It's there's a very hard area to research, at least at this stage, because you can ask sort of theoretical questions. What if you learned that, blah, blah, blah. But until people encounter it or even understand it, it's very hard to ask consumers about these things. And we're a consumer research company. I do think, though, the thing we have researched is the one part of what you said, which is that podcasting has really worked for advertisers, and in part because people trust the hosts and they trust the sort of whole ecosphere that has been created within podcasting, and anything done to disturb that sense of connection is extremely dangerous. The one aspect of using AI voices that has made some sense to me is the idea of taking someone's voice and doing announcer read spots, hopefully sincere, and all the good parts in other languages. That all of a sudden they could flip it over into another language, or even flip their whole show over into another language using their voice. That I thought was kind of an intriguing idea, and at least worth exploring. And if it ever got so good that you could actually just have, whatever podcast that's currently being made in English have all the same qualities to it, but somehow just be transformed into Hungarian or whatever. I do think that's an intriguing idea, but it has to work, and it would have to deliver what you're talking about, Dan, which is that sort of faithful experience that delivers what's made podcasting so special.
Totally agree with you. And we've said so publicly, if you're talking about translation into other languages so that people that have no other opportunity to hear can hear, and the spirit and the intent and the meaning doesn't shift, then that's a good thing. That's the right use of technology. But when we're in the middle of saying, trust me because, except you didn't even know that you said that, now we got a problem. Now we got a problem. And so we try to be, sometimes a voice in the wilderness. We're trying to sound the alarm on things that we think that are going to hurt us 5 to 10 years out, and the trades that we're making today to get there. Because as happy and as bullish as we are on all things audio, there's times when moving toward the future is the right thing, and there's times where I think we need to deliberately resist. This is one of those areas. I'll give you the last word, Neal, and then I want to wrap and just hear a little bit more about Edison Research.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on the point about what sets podcasting apart in some way. I mean, not completely apart, but is the trust and authenticity that it has versus other media channels. And I think I was struck by a report from Global. Global is a big UK audio company, and they did a report on advertising within the comedy genre. And they found that, close to 70% of the listeners prefer host-read ads where it's clear that the host uses the product or service. And not that if it's done through AI, doesn't mean that they don't use the product or service, but there is like that gap that you have to cross, right? And I think it just allows for a lot more gray area in what is real and what is not real.
Well, Larry, I know you've been a warrior for this medium for a long time. And I'd love to just wrap by having you share with us a little bit about what Edison is and exists to do. And then if there are people listening that might be able to advance their business and the industry by partnering with you, how they might be able to do that.
So I'll start with that last part, which is you can just send us an email, info at edisonresearch.com, and we'll get it and respond to you right away. And we'd love to hear from anybody. With regard to sort of your world and your listeners' world, we have three basic things that we do that I think would be of interest to all. We do a very high-profile study every year called Infinite Dial, which pretty much everyone in the podcasting industry knows. It's almost become the annual report card of the podcasting industry. We've talked at length today about Share of Ear, which is a syndicated product that is available to advertising companies, advertisers, through a partnership we have with Nielsen. But contact us and we'll get you to the right place. And we have a third product, which you touched on at the very, very beginning, Dan, which we call Edison Podcast Metrics, where we're doing a super large survey of the entire podcasting space and getting what we think are the best measurements available of the weekly reach of individual large podcasts and the weekly reach of networks. It's the only service that's measuring the entire space. There's no opting in. It's a survey-based methodology. It's run really, really well for us. And that data is available to advertisers and advertising agencies as well through our partnership with Nielsen, which we'd love to talk to people about.
Larry, how long is that list of shows that you're measuring?
So in essence, it's all the shows, right? We are doing 20,000 interviews per year, and any shows that anyone mentions, we are tracking down what they're talking about and measuring it. So anything anyone says is going to get measured. So in theory, all shows are being measured. Now, there's a huge long tail in the world of podcasting. And of course, from a research perspective, if you have some tiny show, even out of 20,000 interviews, if just one person said they listened to it, that's probably an overstatement of the number of people listening. And if no one does, obviously it's an understatement because somebody's listening to that show. And from a research perspective, that's really good data. But we have hundreds upon hundreds of the bigger shows where we have extremely, in my opinion, accurate estimates of the weekly reach of those shows. And again, we're in the field every single day of the year. We're doing all the appropriate things to sample the weekly podcast listening base correctly. And, so we're 20,000 interviews done over the course of the year. It's an enormous sample size and it yields really, really good estimates.
Well, Larry, Edison Research, wonderful. Keep fighting the good fight. Thanks for joining us today. And thank you all for joining the Media Roundtable. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in audio and to use your influence for good. As members of the marketing community, we believe we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain, but edify, and to rise above our differences and show that collaboration is possible when we treat each other with respect. If you're a marketer looking to align your vision with ours, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com and make sure you subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. It's still free. And thank you again to our guest, Larry Rosin, the team at Edison Research, and to Bianca, Kyle, Haley, Jennifer, all of my co-hosts, and the team at Podcast One. And as always, influence responsibly.